Hello there, my fellow thinkers and dreamers. This is Mind Palace Musings, and I am your host, David Wellman. In the previous episode, we discussed thought and had some thoughts on thought. It's not something many of us think about. We don't really think about thinking. That's, meta thought, I suppose. And while many people could stand to do with a bit more thinking in their lives, I suppose it's not as important to direct that extra thought towards thought. But you wouldn't be here listening to this if you weren't that special kind of curious individual, so here we are. As I discussed in the last episode, I initially had planned this to be a short mini-series, but then I kind of realized that the notes I had wouldn't really be enough for each kind of category to have its own episode, so I'm instead going to compress them into this one episode. And if somehow, by some stroke of random chaos, it ends up being long enough that it warrants a third episode, then so be it. So, without further ado, let's discuss some of my other ideas on thought, some other things I'd like to discuss about it that won't necessarily be able to fit in their own episode. This is going to be creatively named More Thoughts on Thought. No assumptions today. I'm instead just going to put forth a disclaimer. What we're about to discuss does not really have any basis in modern material science. These aren't topics that are going to be discussed by scholars or philosophers who take themselves seriously. But I think they're fun, and I think they're worth discussing, just because while they may not necessarily be useful or may not even have any kind of basis in reality, for all we know, as we can currently measure it, it may spark the mind of the next great author or philosopher or neuroscientist or something. Maybe I inspire someone to do great things, whether that be myself or one of you, my darling listeners. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. If you disagree with what is discussed in this episode, that's fair enough. And yeah, have an open mind and have a good time. Let's get started. Thoughts are interesting, and as I mentioned, I don't think we as a society really spend enough time thinking about them, not en masse in any case. You're not going to find mainstream media, asking us philosophical questions to make us ponder our existence and wonder truly if we ever should have left the primordial soup from which we crawled out. No, they just want to sell you clickbait so that they can get ad revenue off of you, which is a shame, but that's kind of the world we live in, where everything's free, but you just have to pay with your soul and all your personal data. So it's interesting because some thoughts have more protection than most people. If you consider the life of a child in, let's say, China or Sudan, they have less rights and protections than Mickey Mouse, for example. You've got this huge corporation that will crush all opposition if they ever feel any kind of, what am I trying to say? If they feel threatened by how others would wish to use their thoughts or steal them, air quotes, if someone misuses Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, wrath will fall down on them. Whereas, if a child dies in a bombing in the Middle East, or is forced to work 12, 13, 14, 16, even 18-hour days in a cramped, smoggy factory in China, they don't care. This is maybe an indication that we are living through the end times currently, but I will leave you to question that for yourself. What we can say is that it's very odd that in some and many cases the law of trademark and copyright are stronger than just our empathy towards our fellow man. We've built this society where ideas have been elevated to this status of godhood. If you consider brands by big rappers and music stars like, Kanye West's clothing line, or Beats by Dr. Dre, you are not paying for a material good, but rather the lifestyle and ultimately the idea behind it. This is not just a shitty pair of headphones made in China with a cheap sticker on it. This is straight from the mind of Dr. Dre. This is the must-have thing. Somehow your own ideas have put you on a path where you must consume the ideas of others. I realize as I'm saying this, the irony, considering you're currently listening to my podcast. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing that people want branded things. I'm obviously not free from this. Many aren't. And even if you're not buying something branded and you're instead getting a handmade product, you are still buying into the idea space of that creator. If you get an artist to commission a piece of art for you, or even if you're just buying a piece they have independently created, you are paying for their idea and their vision, combined with the skill it took to produce that artifact, that object. It's an entanglement of their non-tangible ideas in the physical space through the the machinations of their material form. They are using material means in order to trap an idea in the material space so that it is able to be enjoyed by others, since as far as we know, we can't really just beam thoughts to each other. I don't know if you can hear those birds in the background. For those of you who aren't South African, they're called hardy-dars, and they are the fucking bane of our existence. Sorry about that. Now, it's not only thoughts that we can kind of trap in the material world and elevate to this position that they have greater rights than some or most people living in the world. Thoughts can also take on a life of their own while in the material space. They can exist well after their creator and change in many different ways. Going back to the Mickey Mouse example, obviously Walt Disney had a certain vision when creating him, and he has since died, and his legacy lives on through his thoughts, obviously entangled within physical space. Without his creation of Mickey Mouse, people would probably not really remember him as much as they do today. When you see Mickey Mouse, you're not only attuning yourself to the ideas of its creator in how it should be used, but also the faceless entity behind it, the corporation that is Disney, controlling his every move. But I could go and draw Mickey Mouse doing some obscene act and put it out on the internet, and I have now changed how that idea works. If someone were to witness that, it might change in their mind space how they might interact with that character in non-physical means. I don't know if that makes any sense, but we're going to roll with it. On a similar vein, it's our thoughts that allow the dead to keep living. As we keep people in our thought space, they are never truly gone. Alexander the Great lives on because of his legacy, because we keep him in our thoughts through the works that he has produced, and by the works he has produced, I mean all the nations he conquered. Not to diminish his achievements, it's kind of in the name Alexander the Great that he did great things. At least I'm assuming that's why he's named that. I didn't do history in high school, and I am certainly not going to start now. No, I'm kidding. I do find history fascinating. I just haven't specifically studied anything to do with Alexander the Great. But he's a good example because, again, had his legacy not lived on, had we not kept him in our minds and thoughts, he'd be dead. He'd be gone, vanished to the winds of time and entropy. Truly, he would be lost. As long as we have people in our thoughts, they aren't gone. Sure, their material form has since stopped functioning, and perhaps even their soul or consciousness has moved on or ceased to be. But we get to entangle a small piece of them, our version of them, because, of course, those fucking hardy-dos. Sorry. I lost my train of thought. Those fucking birds. Sorry. In our minds, through our thoughts, we obviously have an image of ourselves, but that's not really who we are. We're a combination of that and how other people perceive us, because we can only really project the essence of our consciousness, but not our consciousness itself. So who we are also determines on how we are observed, which ties into the whole actors and observers philosophy from one of my earlier episodes. So it's through this that we can at least keep a part of someone alive. The more people that have you in their thoughts from many different angles, the more robust this lingering projection of your consciousness and thoughts are after your physical death. And I should hope that at least puts some ease to those of you that are terrified of dying. Yes, the notion that conscious experience may end is terrifying. We don't know what's going to happen after we die, and while many of us have taken a stab at it, myself included, we could all be wrong. But take some comfort in knowing that your loved ones and even your enemies, they have no choice. Acquaintances, co-workers, anyone who knows you in any kind of facet or way will keep you alive after you are dead. Now, let's discuss thought as a physical construct. Of course, physical not necessarily in the material sense, but more so as a construct. Imagine thought having more space than inside our heads, some kind of external space within our consciousness that we wouldn't really be able to monitor with material means, as science stands today anyway. Now, I briefly alluded to this in the previous episode, but what if our consciousness resided in some kind of superspace, that being where the soul or the consciousness resides, and that intersection with our physical meat brain is what produces our conscious living experience. It would be through this superstructure that each thought is generated, distilled, denoised, enriched, any kind of process you can think to get that thought from some raw, chaotic state to something that our brains can react to and understand without driving us mad. Every time a new type of thought is required, a new wing is added to this superstructure, like assembly lines in a factory. Now, this isn't too dissimilar to how our actual brains work, as neurons form pathways, and once a familiar thought pattern has been achieved, our brain will prioritize kind of using that neural pathway. It's a form of abstraction. Now, for those who don't remember or are new or just don't know, abstraction is a term used quite heavily in programming where you can hide away the finer, nitty-gritty, difficult, tedious details of some implementation so that someone less skilled or just with less knowledge or context can still use that. That's the reason why I, as a software developer today, can do far more technologically surprising. No, that's the wrong word. I can achieve more on my own than, programming-wise, of course, than the entire Apollo team could, just because hardware has improved, and because of abstraction, I'd be able to produce quite a big behemoth of a system without any outside help, simply by using tools that are already available. So in the same way, our brains do this so that we don't have to go through the tedious process every time we want to do something repetitive. It simply forms a pathway, remembers that pathway, and now you're kind of stuck in a pattern where every time you walk in the bathroom, you instinctively flip the light switch, even if there's no power. You just instinctively know, I have entered bathroom, flip the switch. And this is very similar to how just programming works in general. Now, what if there is a non-material conscious component to this, where our brain chemistry and our, for lack of a better term, our conscious chemistry kind of align in a way that makes sense, so that our thoughts are coming to us from some external place outside of this material realm. I don't know if there's any kind of philosophical writings from the more traditional philosophers about this topic. I know Jung has covered something similar with his archetypes, and I'll kind of go into greater detail into Jung and his archetypes in future episodes, but as it stands now, I am not prepared or experienced enough for that. I'd need to do some more reading on him, and I do plan to read more of his books when I have time. Now, I call these the corridors of consciousness, these grand superstructures that probably lay dormant, many wings that have been abandoned through however many lives you've had. Of course, you only need to use what your current iteration of life knows. Every time a new iteration is spun up through childbirth, a new superstructure is added to this grand mind palace. It's probably been long abandoned by those that constructed it, because it's been constructed and now we get to use it. There are times where in dreams or even through drug use, people may find themselves in these corridors of consciousness, these places that feel so intensely familiar, yet you have no memories of them. It's nostalgia for a time that never was and may never be. Through any combination of practicing lucid dreaming, psychedelic use, or even meditation, you might too wander these halls and return back to a more primitive self, one unburdened with material existence, reality, dreams, or wants, a desire, or constant nagging for more chemicals. Perhaps this is where our consciousness comes from, once starting as a single point of pure everything and branching out to experience different lives and different experiences. Perhaps one day, when we have completed this great work, we'll be able to step back and witness it in its completed glory. Now, when we think of thought, we typically don't really give it much of anything, no personality nor agency. But what if thoughts exist as extant entities, try saying that 3 times quickly, that have as much a desire to exist as we have a desire to bring them into existence? What if our thoughts are not really our own, not from the sense of like a biological standpoint, which I briefly touched on last episode, but what if a thought is some kind of conscious construct that is an entity, something that exists and experiences the world, perhaps not in the ways that we would as physical fleshy beings, but what if any given thought is born, trickled through some process, and eventually brought into your mind, where it might gestate for however long and eventually be born? Perhaps this is how great artworks and songs and products of architecture and product design are created. Perhaps these thoughts are finding the right vessel, the right person to bring them into being. Perhaps this is how the great musicians got their songs. They put in the time and effort to learn the skill to act as some kind of tool to bring this song into being. And as we practice, we might attract the attention of more ambitious thoughts. I think it's a fun idea. Not necessarily saying there's any kind of logical basis to it, but it's a fun idea. And many creatives will say that they don't know where their inspiration has come from. It's a flash of inspiration from somewhere, be it cosmic background radiation or divine intervention, drug-fueled mania, or a thought desperately wanting to be born. I've noticed when I'm under the effects of weed that I feel this to a greater extent. I'll have ideas for drawings and I'll stop what I'm doing to go and put them on the page. Perhaps it alters my brain chemistry in such a way that the thoughts become more needy, they become more anxious, they want more attention from me, they want me to work harder, they're desperate to get out of my head. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that feels that way. I know a lot of creatives will, take any manner of substance to inspire their works, to pull more out of themselves. We are complex biological machines powered by chemicals and electricity, and adding more substances to the mix may apply different characteristics to our thoughts. So give that some thought. Sorry, that was a lame pun, but it had to be said. That is a thought that wanted to exist, so it's out of my control. I'm not apologizing for that one. What are the implications of this grand journey on thought that we've gone through? Well, there may be more to thought than you think, and there may be more to thinking than you had thought. We might act rather as receivers for thought rather than generators. Our bodies acting as tools to bring these thoughts into the physical material world. Our thoughts about thought can change how that thought is thought about, and these thoughts may be elevated to a place of godhood, and the gods themselves may merely be thought shared amongst many projectors, keeping those thoughts alive. We will all die someday, but our thoughts won't, nor will the thoughts on our thoughts, that meta-thought, and perhaps one day the grand puzzle will be solved and we'll be able to witness all the hard work that our thinking has gone towards. My fellow thinkers and dreamers, my dear seekers of truth and knowledge, thanks for listening. This was an interesting little dive down into thought, and I'm happy to have given you some of my thoughts on thought. It's been a super crazy weekend. I am in the process of adopting a kitten, so I didn't really have much time to write any notes for this, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I kind of like how this episode turned out. Now, how my ramblings will be received by you, my viewers, is another story. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see what you think. Ha ha ha. So, if you were enjoying the podcast, please leave it a like or a review or share it. I don't know what platform you're on. I don't know what physical device you're using. Perhaps it's the year 3000 and this is being beamed straight into your brain receptacle. I don't know. But yeah, if you could share it and provide some feedback, that would be greatly appreciated. Why not join the discussion on Reddit at r/mindpalacemusings. You can follow the official Twitter account for updates. That's at @mpm_podcast. If you'd like to take a look at my weird and wonderful psychedelic trippy art, you can find me on Instagram at David_Wellman, just one L. And as promised in the last episode, I have set up a Patreon. So for my more dedicated viewers, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can find that at Patreon/mindpalacemusings, all one word, and that will also be in the description. And if you'd like to support the show without... actually, let me explain the Patreon tier. So for now, I've just added one tier, which is just $2 a month. And for those that pledge, I will give you a shout out at the end of every episode. So if you would like to support the podcast, but you don't want to do a monthly subscription, you can also find me on Coffee, also at Mind Palace Musings. And that's more of like a one-off payment, like, hey, go buy a coffee. That would be great too. But again, this is just a hobby, just something I do for fun. So please don't feel obligated to do so. Those details will all be in the description. And there are those hardy dogs again. I apologize for the times they did pick up in the recording. I tried to... Thank you. I tried to stop the recording when they picked up, but I didn't really manage to do it every time. And sometimes I was just on a roll and I didn't want to kind of cut the train short. You know how important those trains of thought are. So, yeah, I think that's all. Thank you for listening. I love you. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. This has been Mind Palace Musings. I have been your host, David Wellman. And please, stay curious.